Good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I wish we were together in person, but have come to appreciate the technology that allows us to still meet together and share our code knowledge. And like Philippe said, I hope over the course of the presentation, you'll understand that Mariah and I really do love digging through the codes and finding solutions and being collaborative with the architects and owners' goals of a project. I'm sorry, I just need to shift the videos so I can. All right, there we go. To give you a quick snapshot of AKF Group, our local office in Boston is a short walk from the BSA space. We are currently located over on Bedford Street. And we're primarily located up and down the East Coast with an office in Minnesota, as well as 2 offices in Mexico, although we do work in all regions over the US and internationally. As you can see, we have quite a broad portfolio of project experience. Mariah and I share a portfolio in the senior living and, which falls within both healthcare and residential portfolio types. And you may know us as MEP FP engineers. That's how the company was founded 30+ years ago. Mariah and I are part of a team of architectural code consultants who spend all day long helping folks like yourselves navigate the codes, develop life safety plans, code interpretations, variance applications. So our focus is anything building, fire, life safety, and accessibility. And our learning objectives today are to outline the differences in the 3 major types of senior living facilities, to identify common amenity spaces and what that may mean for your project, how that increases some code requirements or things outside of the residential spaces. Understand common strategies for code compliance throughout senior living facilities, and also to identify some recent code changes that have occurred over the years in our upcoming and newer editions of the code. So starting with the basics, our applicable codes. All jurisdictions within the US are now using some version of the International Building Code. This makes our lives a lot easier. Some jurisdictions also work or adopt NFPA 101, the life safety code, as part of either their building code or fire code. So it's always important to keep in mind when you're navigating multiple code editions that you need to make sure you're designing to the most restrictive of the 2 requirements. And we do see discrepancies between the 2 from time to time. There are local codes. Most jurisdictions will have a separate set of amendments. Sometimes they're published in a completely separate document that makes the amendments very readily available to understand what sections of the base codes are amended. Others will publish their building code with the amendments incorporated into the text of the code documents themselves. There are a number of local laws as well in different jurisdictions. A few examples of those: in Massachusetts, there's a special general law that requires all nursing homes be of type 1B construction. So that's type 2 construction. New Hampshire's licensing requirements, so Department of Health requires additional requirements above and beyond the base building code to pull in some healthcare requirements from the life safety code. And sometimes we even see local cities and towns have unique requirements. One example is that Londonderry, New Hampshire has special fire alarm requirements for senior living facilities. I also want to mention that Mariah and I are going to give kind of a broad overview of the base code requirements. We'll incorporate any of these unique amendments that we're aware of, but we realize most of you are probably working in multiple cities, towns, states. So we'll try to keep it very general. And also, this is simply a presentation of the the requirements in the code. We understand there are cases to use compliance alternatives or variances and to come up with creative solutions around the black and white text of the code. But for today's purposes, we're just working through the knowledge of the codes themselves. So the agenda for the presentation, Mariah is going to run through an introduction of modern senior living facilities. And as I mentioned, the different occupancy classifications that occur in most of these facilities. We'll identify some of the major code requirements for different senior living facilities, identify the amenity space requirements, and then common code strategies for these projects.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. So I guess before I get into the meat of this, if you guys do have questions throughout, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on it. If we can send a quick response, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll try to answer questions at the end of the presentation. But so jumping into what modern senior living communities are. They are definitely complex from a code standpoint. Caitlin and I probably think of them as fun from a code standpoint because there's all sorts of different requirements that could apply depending on the programming or the specific design of the space. So you'll probably hear the phrase aging in place a lot from a programming standpoint, which usually means that the facility has different housing options so that someone can stay within that community should their needs change and they need a different type of housing. As Caitlin mentioned, there's usually several different types of amenities that are provided to really create a community type of atmosphere. That could be restaurant spaces or salons or performance spaces or fitness centers, all sorts of different things that on their own also have certain code requirements. On top of that, with all of these different housing options and different amenities, a lot of times these communities end up being either large buildings or multiple buildings on a site. So there will be code requirements that dictate how you protect one building from another or how you consider all of these different programs in the same building or different buildings. So if you want to head to the next slide. So from a code standpoint, even though there might be different names for different programs or different services that are provided, the code really outlines these three different buckets that a senior living project will need to fit into in order to figure out which code requirements apply to the project. So it's going to be either an independent living facility, assisted living facility, or skilled nursing facility or nursing home facility. So if you want to head to the next slide. So starting off, independent living facilities are usually set up in an apartment or condo style design. The main difference between independent living facilities and the other types of senior living facilities is that in an independent living facility, the code assumes that the residents are capable of responding to an emergency on their own. There's not any other staff assistance other than what would be provided in any other apartment style building. So because of that, the code would specify a group R2 classification under the IBC. If you're in a jurisdiction that adopts 101, you're going to fall under Chapter 30, which is the apartment building section. Even though it says apartment buildings, this would apply to any type of apartment or condo style independent living facility. So assisted living facilities kind of sit in this middle ground between an independent living facility and your skilled nursing or nursing home type facility. And in that middle ground, there are often lots of shades of gray. This is probably the most complex from a classification standpoint. May not require the most robust features in the facility, but there are a lot of nuances with this type of classification depending on what codes apply in the jurisdiction that you're working in. So starting off, while not a code requirement, we typically see these facilities designed in a sleeping unit type program where there might be common dining or activity spaces. Again, not required by code, but if you're leaning towards that type of design, you might be falling into an assisted living category. The main difference between independent living is that under, I'll say, current codes, the code assumes that residents in an assisted living facility are going to require some type of verbal or physical assistance during an emergency. There was a change, a pretty significant change in the 2015 IBC. So that designation applies 2015 IBC and later, which most New England states are on. There may be a few states that are still on 2012 or earlier. If you're on 2012 or earlier, know that under those additions, assisted living facilities were only considered group I1 uses. And under that group I1 category, occupants couldn't need any type of assistance during an emergency. Obviously, that's not realistic. It's an assisted living facility. If occupants are receiving assistance for normal day-to-day activities, it's only natural that they would need some type of assistance in emergency. So in the 2015, they split that classification. So now 2015 IBC and later, it's going to be I1 condition 2 is going to be the appropriate classification. It's not just a name change. As part of that change in classification, the IBC also pulled in some of the requirements that used to only apply to skilled nursing or nursing home facilities, particularly smoke compartments, which Caitlin's going to get into in a little bit. So just know that if you're dealing in a jurisdiction that's 2012 or earlier, you're going to have to take a close look at what classification your facility is going to fall in. And then because the code didn't really do a great job of regulating assisted living facilities, these are facilities that tend to have a lot of local amendments or local licensing requirements that might get pulled in because jurisdictions were trying to regulate them better than the IBC was doing. On top of all of that, if you're in a jurisdiction that adopts NFPA 101, there's even more complexity because depending on whether medical care is provided, you're either going to fall into one of two chapters. So if medical care is not provided in the facility, you're going to fall into residential board and care, which is going to be chapter 32. If you do, if there is some limited amount of medical care, not full nursing care, but some limited amount of care, you're going to fall into the healthcare chapter of chapter 18 as a limited care facility. I know that that was a lot of information. Hopefully the main takeaway is that if you have an assisted living facility, have the conversation up front to figure out what program you're going with and what that falls into based on the codes that apply in your jurisdiction. So finally, skilled nursing facilities. So this is the highest level of medical care above and beyond what you would find in an assisted living facility. Might have similar layouts to assisted living facilities where you have that sleeping unit layout with some common dining or activity spaces. But the code assumes that residents are going to need full help during an emergency. It might involve moving residents in beds, but it's assumed that they will not be able to respond to an emergency situation. So as part of that, they are considered group I2 classifications under the IBC. Similarly, in 2015, there are now what are called conditions. So there's different categories of group I2 facilities, not as significant of a change. This was just to differentiate nursing home and skilled nursing facilities from hospitals. So skilled nursing is I2 condition 1. And then if you're in a jurisdiction that follows 101, you're going to fall under chapter 18, but for nursing home requirements, not limited care facility requirements.
Yeah, so I think in summary there, what we've found is assisted living facilities, senior living facilities are probably the most complex projects from an occupancy classification standpoint. Usually it's very easy to understand if you have business use, assembly use, an inpatient hospital. But when we hear the term senior living or assisted living, we really need to dig deeper and understand the level of care that is occurring throughout the facility. So now jumping into some of the nitty-gritty of the code requirements. Bear with us, I know code and graphs and text isn't that exciting, but we're gonna try to keep it interesting here. So to start at, okay, we classified our building type, and oftentimes we see all three in one facility. So understanding that there are different complexities when you have multiple occupancy types. But so we have our occupancy classification, and now we need to understand how large can the building be. So both IBC and NFPA 101 regulate the number of stories in a facility. IBC also addresses the height of a building in feet and also the area. So the square footage on a floor by floor basis and also the aggregate. So this chart here, we're trying to break down a few examples of the common construction types that we see for these types of facilities. Type 1B construction is non-combustible 2-hour rated. You see the chart here, we're graphing the number of stories allowed. And on the bottom, we see increasing levels of care. So on the left-hand side, it's our independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing. And we're trying to compare just the different regulations by the code. So independent living falls under the IBC at 12 stories. You see here's a great example under assisted living for where you have 3 different requirements or limitations based on the specific use of the building. So if we were in a jurisdiction where 101 was adopted as well, actually 101 is more forgiving. So IBC is more restrictive. So you're actually limited to 10 stories, even though the life safety code would allow you to build higher. Same thing in skilled nursing. IBC is much more restrictive there on the height of the building. So jumping into type 2A construction. So this is also non-combustible construction, 1-hour rating. So think your metal stud construction with protection. You see the building gets a lot smaller here. So we're reducing down to 5 or 4 stories across the board. And then lastly, we have type 2B construction. This is non-combustible construction, no rated protection in the base structure of the building. We'll address where rated construction is required elsewhere. But as you can see, as the level of care increases, the size of the building is being reduced. And that's pretty straightforward of just, we don't want these high-rise buildings with no rated protection on the structure with folks who need assistance evacuating or defending in place. So the fire rated separations, this will depend on the different classifications. Corridors are required to be half-hour rated for independent living. Again, we always assume everything is fully sprinklered because today you can't build much without a sprinkler system throughout. So half-hour rated corridors are required in the corridors, and then unit separations must be either 1 hour or half-hour rated fire partitions, depending on the construction type of the facility. So in our higher construction types, these will be 1 hours, 1 hour rated walls. In type 2B or 5B, you're allowed to reduce the dwelling unit separations to a half-hour rating. But as you can tell, you're still providing some form of protection from one unit to another. The floors and ceilings are also required to be rated, so you're fully protected from any units above and below as well. Assisted living facilities will require the corridors to have a 1 hour rating. So we see that increase from half hour to 1 hour. However, the rules for dwelling unit separations stay the same. Depending on your construction type, you're either going to have a 1 hour rating or a half hour rating. And lastly, skilled nursing. This might come to you as a surprise. This is probably one of the few or only areas where skilled nursing is less conservative than the lower construction type. So the corridors are only required to be smoke partitions. Those are non-rated smoke partitions. And no separation is required between units. We often get the question, why? Because of the level of care in a skilled nursing, there are additional life safety measures above and beyond what you would see in a traditional residential setting. So for those reasons, you're required to reduce, or you'll see less requirements here in regards to construction and unit separations. Also, this population type typically requires more supervision. So oftentimes the corridor doors are propped open so that the staff can have easy access to the patients. So what good does a rated wall do if your doors are propped open? Okay, spaces open to corridors. This is usually a fan favorite for architects. Studies have shown that the resident well-being is increased when they're located in a more home-like atmosphere, as opposed to, the old, long, stark white corridors where patients are often confused. So the building code and life safety code have incorporated ways to really foster that well-being and creation of more home-like environments. So our lounges in commercial kitchens, I'm sorry, not commercial kitchens, it's a domestic kitchen intended to serve the residents, are allowed to be open to the corridor units, the corridors. So lounges are allowed to be open in all 3 occupancy types. There's one condition that your surrounding walls are still rated as the corridor. So from a means of egress standpoint, you're still within a protected path once you leave your unit or other space on the floor to reach an exit. That having this open doesn't compromise that protection. And then kitchens are allowed to be open in an assisted living and skilled nursing facility. Obviously, in an independent living facility, you're going to have your kitchens within your unit. So that's not an issue there. The 2018 edition of the IBC introduced the allowance for assisted living facilities. So in Massachusetts, that's not allowed by code. We've used that approach just based on future code additions in language and just the evolution of the codes to make that case for some of our projects. Additional life safety measures would include smoke detection. And then there's very specific limitations or requirements for the kitchen equipment. As I mentioned, or I got a little tongue-tied earlier, the kitchen equipment has to be domestic kitchen equipment. This isn't intended to serve as a large dining hall for the entire facility. It's really just to create, as I mentioned, a more kind of home-like kitchen or living area. Manual or timed shutoffs are required for the equipment. There's a minimum CFM for the exhaust on the hoods. A suppression system is required, local smoke alarms. And then, as I mentioned, the intent here is really to serve just a small group on the floor. So there's a maximum number of patients that the kitchen can serve. Smoke compartments. So Mariah mentioned this earlier. This is common in a healthcare setting and then also for assisted living facilities and nursing homes. And the intent here is to recognize that evacuating a building during an emergency would be an operational nightmare in one of these facilities. So what we're going to do is provide extra life safety measures to provide a safe zone for occupants to defend in place. So we're required to add a 1 hour rated smoke barrier, and that must extend from exterior wall to exterior wall to truly separate the building into multiple compartments. 20-minute doors are required. The maximum square footage of each smoke compartment is 22,500. In this floor plate, we're only showing 2. On some projects, we have 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, depending on the size of the facility. And then the requirement for refuge areas is to allow space to serve occupants of the other side. So let's imagine there's a fire event in compartment B. We want to be able to move these patients horizontally instead of vertically down the stairs to the other side, and to have enough room within this smoke compartment for them to await further assistance or for the fire department to suppress the fire. So 6 square feet per occupant is required for non-residents. That would be your staff and visitors. 15 square feet for assisted living residents, and then 30 square feet per occupant for skilled nursing patients. And it gets larger as the level of care increases, because you may be evacuating or you may be moving patients or residents with either on stretchers or beds, wheelchairs. So that's why you need the larger space. And this doesn't have to be a dedicated empty space on your floor plan that you can't do anything with during normal operations. You can use common spaces, dining room areas, corridors, as long as you're providing enough square footage. You have movable furniture, you have unlocked doors, that you have the ability to access the space in the event of an emergency. And then lastly, there's a maximum travel distance measurement. So from anywhere in a smoke compartment, you need to be able to reach the smoke barrier within 200 feet.
All right, so just really quick before I dive into the fire protection requirements, I just wanted to make note there's been a couple great points made in the chat. So Lewis had a great point. If your facility falls within the jurisdiction of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, you're going to be subject to NFPA 101, even if your local jurisdiction does not adopt NFPA 101. So keep that in mind.
Yes. And can I add a note there? Thank you for that. The CMS regulations are still using the 2012 version of NFPA 101. So we've fallen under or projects where we have the 2015 IBC, the 2018 edition of NFPA 101 is adopted by the state, and they're also following NFPA 101 for Joint Commission and CMS, so that's the 2012 edition. So again, you need to be able to compare all the codes and use the most restrictive unless the local officials are willing to work with you on compliance alternatives based on future editions of the codes, which in my opinion have gotten smarter over the years to identify ways to really maximize safety and design all together.
Yeah. Last I had heard, so the 2021 edition of NFPA 101 just came out, obviously. Folks at NFPA have said it's probably not likely that Joint Commission, CMS will adopt that edition. They're thinking they'll wait till the next one, though it's possible that they could adopt 2021, but just for anybody with projects that fall under their jurisdiction, just giving you an update for that based on what we know. 2 other things that just came up in the chat. Ruth mentioned again that in Massachusetts, nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities are required to be type 1B construction based on the Mass General Law. And then Teresa noted that the Facility Guidelines Institute is going to be issuing a draft of guidelines for emergency conditions and health and residential care shortly. She said hopefully within a month, and they will be asking for comments on the draft from the AEC and AHJ community. So just keep a lookout for that.
Teresa, if you could pass that along to Philippe and Diane and Ruth when that's available, I think that would be great to distribute to this group.
Yeah, I'll do that. It should be out shortly, hopefully. So keeping an eye out.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Yep.
So thanks everybody. Those were great. Again, if there's anything else, feel free to shoot it in the chat. We'll address it throughout. So back into the presentation, fire protection systems. Caitlin touched on this briefly. So all of these facilities are going to require a sprinkler system, just based on the nature of the occupants within the facility. Assisted living and skilled nursing will also require a fire alarm system. Chances are you're also going to need a fire alarm system in independent living unless you're dealing with a very small building. But whereas these communities typically have larger buildings and different spaces, you will most likely need a fire alarm system as well. And then assisted living and skilled nursing will also need corridor smoke detection, which independent living does not. So getting into some means of egress requirements. So the exit access travel distance limits will differ depending on what type of facility you have. So independent living gets 250 feet maximum. Assisted living, it's going to depend on the type of facility and also whether 101 applies. So if 101 does not apply and you're just dealing with the IBC, you're also allowed 250 feet. If you are dealing with 101, if you're residential board and care, so there's no medical care provided, you can use the 250 feet for your maximum travel distance. But if you're a limited care facility, so there is some type of medical care being provided, you're stuck with the 200 feet, which is similar to skilled nursing facilities. And as Caitlin mentioned, so this is the travel distance to the exit door. The travel distance to the smoke barrier door is going to be 200 feet for any assisted living or skilled nursing facility. So common path of travel. So we tend to get a lot of questions on common path of travel in general. So common path of travel is going to be the distance where an occupant only has one direction to travel. So it's not measured to an exit door. It's going to be measured to a point where somebody would have a choice of two paths to egress. So as shown on the slide, it's measured from within this unit. The person in the unit can only go out into the corridor and take a left. That's the only way that they can go. So that is your common path. Once they reach the adjoining corridor, they have a choice to either continue left to the exit stair or continue upward to another exit. So that would be the point your common path of travel ends. So for everything but independent living, that distance is going to be limited to 75 feet. For independent living, it's going to be 125 feet. And then similar to common path of travel, so dead end distances are also measured to a point where somebody would have basically a choice of two directions, but it's a choice of two corridors. So the dead end distances are only measured within the corridor, whereas as we saw on the last slide, the common path is going to be measured from pretty much anywhere on the floor. So dead end distances are just they're limited to make sure that somebody doesn't have to double back too far if they inadvertently turn down the wrong corridor. So somebody turns down the corridor, realizes that's not the exit and has to turn around. That's why those limits exist in the code. So independent living facilities, dead ends can be a maximum of 50 feet. For assisted living facilities, again, if you're only dealing with the IBC, you can also use the 50-foot limit. If you're dealing with 101, you're stuck to 30 feet for both residential board and care and limited care. And then for skilled nursing, you're limited to 20 feet, regardless of what codes you're looking at. And then another topic that we get a lot of questions on are vertical openings for these facilities. So right off the bat, skilled nursing facilities cannot have any unprotected floor openings. So they cannot have open stairs unless it's constructed as a shaft enclosure or an atrium. So you can't have just an open unprotected stair unless there's some other protection being provided. And that's actually an IBC requirement. So regardless of what jurisdiction you're in, that's going to be your limitation. For independent living and assisted living facilities, you can have open stairs, but there are some caveats. So you are allowed to have open stairs, but remember there's a lot of rated construction that is required for these facilities. So the code's going to require either some type of continuity of that rated construction. So you may have to carry your corridor rating down the opening of the stair to make sure those walls are rated as well, so that whole corridor is protected. You may also be required to provide a separation between the stair and the corridor, whether it's just a smoke separation, or in assisted living facilities where you have the smoke compartments that Caitlin talked about. You may need a smoke barrier separation just so that you're not creating too large of a smoke compartment or connecting two different smoke compartments on different floors. But again, because it's an open stair, not an exit stair, you do have some flexibility of where those separations will live. But just keep in mind that you are allowed to have the open stair, but you do probably need some other type of protection just to maintain these different ratings that are required in the code. So then lastly, elevator lobbies. So all of these different facilities do require some type of elevator protection, whether it's an elevator lobby or some other type of alternate protection, like these smoke curtains that roll down in front of the doors and seal off the elevator opening. It's pretty clear, it has been pretty clear in the codes for assisted living and skilled nursing facilities that protection is required. The nuance comes with independent living facilities. So prior to the 2018 edition of the IBC, it wasn't specifically stated that elevator protection was required for R2 occupancies. As of the 2018, they've added a clarification that the intent is to provide that protection where you have rated corridors. So because group R2 occupancies have rated corridors, 2018 IBC now says you need an elevator lobby or some other type of elevator protection to help preserve, the rated corridor. So again, Massachusetts is still on 2015. There's some other New England states that are on 2015 IBC. So it's not specifically called out in the code, but we have seen certain jurisdictions starting to enforce this because it's now clear in the 2018 IBC that is required. So it's a good idea to provide that type of protection for those facilities. Caitlin, you're on mute.
I saw that. I like the pop-up. Amenity space consideration. So like any residential setting, amenity spaces is what sells. So this is a lot of the fun stuff in a project. So common amenity spaces we see in senior living facilities, fitness centers, pools, meeting and performance spaces, restaurants and bars. These would all fall under the use group A assembly classification. So it's any space where the occupant load is intended to be 50 or more people. Group M or mercantile is our retail facilities. Pharmacies would also fall within group M. So you're thinking probably what's a retail facility? Sometimes you might see it connected, just it's a mixed use development where you might have independent living above the retail spaces. Also, if you have a gift shop within the senior living facility, that would be considered use group M as well. And then use group S covers any storage, so the resident storage, the back of house storage, linen storage, and any attached parking garages. So for assembly spaces, the code is typically more restrictive when it comes to a number of different things. Height and area, so the size of your building, your travel distances, so egress provision. So imagine you have a much denser space and program within an amenity space. So you want to make sure that people are able to evacuate the building quickly. And then also fire alarm systems. So an emergency voice alarm system is required if you have more than 1,000 people based on the IBC provisions. NFPA 101 actually has a threshold of 300 people. We typically wouldn't see an emergency voice alarm system in a non-high-rise building unless it were required for an assembly space, or as I mentioned, a local amendment for specific senior living facilities. Mercantile spaces typically have similar requirements to assembly for egress. There's also more restrictive requirements for exterior wall openings because they're typically on a storefront. We want to make sure that we're providing protection there. If it's within the interior of the building, not a concern. But other things to consider would be increased combustible storage, making sure that you're accommodating for storage space, free egress paths, and that you're not blocking any loading zones and whatnot. And then if there's a pharmacy on site, we always have to be aware of any hazardous materials and the quantities, because once we hit certain thresholds, we require additional life safety measures for high hazard uses or hazardous materials in general. Parking on a complex. So typically there's two types, your enclosed parking garage or your open parking garage. For an open parking facility, the building has to meet certain openness criteria to allow natural ventilation. So a certain percentage of your exterior wall is required to be open. Generally, if you meet those open criteria, you don't require a mechanical ventilation system because you have the means to ventilate naturally. You typically don't require sprinklers. One important note is that if you don't sprinkler an open parking garage and it's attached to, it's either beneath or attached to a portion of the building, it's not considered a fully sprinklered building. And most of the code requirements that we rely on to reduce the fire resistance ratings, the travel distances, increase height and area allowances are based on fully sprinklered conditions. So that's just something important to keep in mind, that if there's an open parking garage and you don't want to sprinkler it, you're going to see implications elsewhere in the building. A few important notes to make. FM Global recently changed their standards to require sprinklers in an open parking garage if you're insured by the company. So that is new, something to keep in mind. And then the 2021 edition of the IBC, which I'm not sure is adopted anywhere, certainly not locally yet, but they will now require sprinklers for open parking garages over 48,000 square feet. So as we're seeing larger and larger facilities, they're asking for sprinklers to be incorporated. As I mentioned, you wouldn't have the ventilation in an open parking garage, but if you have an enclosed parking garage, you require a mechanical ventilation system, you require full sprinklers throughout. And if the ventilation system isn't operating continuously, the parking areas must be provided with both carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide detectors. And when those hit a certain level, it would initiate the ventilation system. And then storage room ratings. Soiled linen rooms are based on the volume of the storage in the space. And general combustible storage, including clean linen storage, is based on the area. So just to give you a couple examples of those, typically the soiled linen rooms are hard to manage, or from a design perspective, we don't know what the expectations are. We don't know how much capacity will be within each soiled linen room. So we usually recommend erring on the side of caution in providing the 1 hour rating for those spaces so that there's no issues down the road once the building's occupied. And then for the clean linen and general combustible storage, it's based on the size, as I mentioned. If you have a room greater than 100 square feet, 1 hour rating is required. Rooms between 50 square feet and 100 square feet require smoke partitions. And then anything below 50 feet don't require any protection. And those are for skilled nursing and assisted living facilities. Your independent living is not as restrictive. So resident storage typically isn't required to be rated unless you had one localized, sometimes you'll see an entire floor dedicated to resident storage, or a certain area in the building where you have multiple units of storage for the residents. So if it were ever a mixed use setting, there may be limitations on either the size, or we can provide a fire protection barrier to separate the occupancies.
All right, so finishing out the presentation, we're going to go into some common code concepts that are used for these different facilities. So if you want to hit the next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, a lot of times with all of these different housing options or all of these different amenities, you end up with just a lot of square footage. So trying to reconcile that with all sorts of different code requirements, and then also wanting to provide the feeling of a connected community leads to some different options for how you address that. So one, I would say, simple option, though a lot of times not the best option, is to just treat all of these different spaces as a single building. And Ruth actually brought this up in the chat. So where you have all of these different occupancies, and really in any approach that you use, whether you're doing a single building or some of the ones we're going to talk about in a bit, you have the choice of whether to go with what's called a non-separated approach or a separated approach. So where you have different occupancies in the same building, if you go with a non-separated approach, that means you don't need rated construction separating your different occupancies, but your code requirements are going to be based on the most restrictive for all the occupancies. Alternatively, you can put fire rated separations between your different occupancies, and that will limit the requirements to that space within the bounds of that fire rated enclosure. So that is an option. However, even with those, if you're dealing with a single building approach, the larger your building gets, as Caitlin mentioned before, the more robust construction type you're going to need. So separate from the fire ratings that Caitlin talked about, or the fire ratings for separating occupancies, you're just going to need that much more fire rated structure within the building, because you're just having a larger building, which the code sees as a larger hazard. So then another option, and again, as we go through this, you can use the separated or non-separated approach for all of these, but another option, instead of treating all of these occupancies as part of one building, you can put a structurally independent fire rated firewall between the two buildings. And that wall is a specific type of wall under the code. It's considered structurally independent because it needs to allow essentially one building to collapse with the wall remaining standing and the adjacent building remaining standing. So if there's a fire in building 1 here and that structure starts to collapse, the wall needs to stay in place and building 2 needs to stay in place so that that building is protected. So by doing that, you can now have different construction types in building 1 and building 2. You can have different occupancies. you can have different programs, and the requirements will be based on what's ever in that particular building. So the requirements applicable to building 1 are not going to apply to building 2 unless they have the same occupancies within them. Some limitations with this, you can have openings in the firewall, so you can provide a connected feel, and those doors can be on hold open so that under normal conditions, you can see through that opening, but the openings are limited to 25% of the length of the wall, just to preserve that substantial fire rated separation. And then depending on the arrangement of the exterior walls, you may need rated exterior walls where that firewall meets the exterior walls of the buildings. So next slide. So in lieu of a fire rated firewall, another option is the code allows pedestrian bridges to connect different buildings. And if you follow all of the requirements in the code for pedestrian bridges, the code considers those connected buildings separate and distinct buildings for the purposes of applying code requirements. So again, this can allow different construction types, different sizes, different uses, and that way you still have that connected feel, but you're not dealing with one big robust building that needs to be, type 1 construction. So some of the requirements for this pedestrian bridge is you will need some type of separation where the bridge connects into each building. Depending on the arrangement, it could be as high as 2 hours. For certain arrangements, that can be reduced to either a smoke partition or sprinkler protected glass. But again, that's just serving to prevent smoke or a fire from going from one building to another. And then where that bridge connects into each building, you may need rated exterior walls around the bridge connection itself, again, just to prevent fire from jumping from one building to another. The bridge will also need to be sprinklered. There are some exceptions where you don't need sprinkler system, usually when you have an open air bridge, but that's generally not used just because, just for comfort reasons, it's usually enclosed. So. And then we see this a lot for independent living buildings, is the concept of podium construction. So this is another allowance in the code that essentially allows you to have 2 different construction types in the same structure. And between those 2 different construction types, you're required to have this 3-hour horizontal separation, separating the 2 different construction types. Now, below the 3-hour horizontal assembly, you can have any use group except the high hazard use group. So you could have assisted living and independent living below the 3-hour horizontal assembly. Above that 3-hour horizontal assembly, for the purposes of our discussion, you really would only be allowed to have the independent living above the 3-hour assembly. You could have some offices and things up there, but the uses are limited once you get above that 3-hour assembly. And then the benefit to doing this is the IBC allows you to measure your number of stories for your building from that 3-hour horizontal assembly. It basically gives you those lower floors for free. And it does that because it requires those lower floors to be of type 1A construction. So you can have any construction type above, but those lower floors need to be type 1A construction. On top of that, even though you can measure your number of stories from that 3-hour assembly, you still need to meet the height and feet limit from grade. So this basically allows you to potentially sandwich a couple more stories within that height and feet limit by getting those type 1A stories essentially for free in the code. And another important note about this approach, while this is recognized and allowed in the IBC, NFPA 101 does not recognize the podium construction approach. So you would still need to meet the story height limits that 101 specifies if you need to follow 101 for your project. All right, so just about done. So just a recap of all of the things that we talked about today. So one of the big takeaways is, as Caitlin mentioned, determine the appropriate occupancy classifications for your facility up front. That's really going to dictate what requirements apply to your building. Take a look at the local amendments to the building codes, what additions of the codes apply, but also any local licensing requirements that you need to follow. As Caitlin mentioned, even down to the town level, there may be some specific requirements that apply. So really take a look at what applies based on the use of your building, especially if it's a jurisdiction you haven't worked in previously. But even then, codes are changing all the time. So it's always good practice to, at the beginning of a project, figure out what classification you are and what's going to apply. Keep in mind that requirements vary, sometimes significantly, between the IBC and NFPA 101. So be aware of what's the most restrictive. There's kind of a misconception out there that NFPA 101 tends to be the most restrictive, but that's not always the case. Sometimes IBC ends up actually being the most restrictive. So just be aware which is going to dictate the requirements for your building. Amenity spaces can trigger other specific requirements just based on the uses and the hazards associated with those spaces. And there are a variety of different options out there for large complexes, while still being able to keep the community-like atmosphere that is so beneficial in these types of facilities. So, right. That was all we had. I'm just gonna take a scroll through the chat. Just see. So just looking at some of the questions here. So I neglected to mention, Fleet did have a question. So any office spaces that you have, those are going to be group B. Spaces you want to be careful of are large conference rooms or conference centers. If you have more than 750 square feet and more than 49 people, those are going to be group A spaces. So licensing requirements. We're not going to get into specific licensing requirements for this presentation just because those vary fairly significantly between different jurisdictions. We can certainly help you work through those requirements. It a lot of times takes just the research of what a specific jurisdiction requires and what type of licensing is being sought for a particular facility.
Yeah, that's typically more on the owner provider side for insurance purposes. So we can help assist with the implications of which licenses the facility is seeking. But there's not a code perspective of when and why you would license one way or the other. That's really more on the operational side.
And if I might jump in here, some organizations like the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and other Department of Health require the architect to be the leader in the submission for any plan reviews. So we go to Caitlin and Mariah for some recommendation of what codes we should refer to, but it's our responsibility as registered architect to submit the plan review and stamp and sign those. We have one more question about bathrooms and grab bars from Drake.
And I'm just about to answer it.
Go ahead.
You can take it, Ruth.
Feel free.
Go for it.
And probably this is something that I would like to do for this group because the previous presentation that I did a while ago, I'm not even sure if it was for the Design for Aging or the Access Code Committee, about how the access regulations and codes really fail the people that we serve, the elderly, the frail, the people that need assist in a lot of activities. And the clearances that the codes go by are just not functioning well. And my experience, even with the Massachusetts Access Board, is if you come to them with a really strong and clear explanation with a demonstration how somebody who has no upper body strength and need maybe 1 or 2 people assist cannot use a toilet that is 18 inches from the wall and requires a different configuration of grab bars, they will go along. And I have projects that we did work on the presentation to be very, very clear and concise, but it's not the access board goal to prevent people from getting the right environment. And they know that those codes were written in the 70s to accommodate people that came back from Vietnam, young men with good upper body strength. So, my experience is that do not get intimidated by the codes or a variance process, because if you have a good case, you'll succeed. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
Absolutely. Thanks
Yeah.
for sharing.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I ran into a problem years ago. It was about the location of controls in a bathroom for assisted medical care. And the access board backed off in favor of what the requirements were for the health providers.
Yeah.
So if somebody is being assisted by a nurse or a doctor or somebody, that would govern over any of the requirements in the access code. And I think that's appropriate.
Of course, thank you. That reminds me, Teresa, you can feel free to chime in here. The FGI guidelines have incorporated requirements for patients of size in a healthcare setting for multiple reasons. Because of the needs of the extra clearances, but oftentimes, like you said, patients need assistance. So it's to accommodate both the patient and the staff who is assisting in the toilet facility. So it will be interesting to see if that is incorporated into the new assisted living regulations.
So for healthcare, it's the size to access people primarily onto a table or operating room table or something like that. It's also in the bathroom. The clearance is on the side, and there's always a question about how the grab bars are set, and they kind of go back and forth on that. They actually ask me what I think about it, and which I don't know. But I think the thing that I mentioned in the chat about the emergency conditions is related to the pandemic and emergency conditions related to hurricanes, weather events, everything. So they're two separate issues, but I just wanted to bring that up to everybody to keep an eye out on that, because they do want everybody's comments on that, and residential care needs as many comments as possible. So I'm just getting a little plug in for there. I worked on the hospital portion of that, but not the residential, but I think it's really important for you guys to take a look at it.
There's another question in the chat. If we have any idea when MAB is going to be updated. There was, it's probably several years old at this point. There were proposed changes that were published and are available on MAB's site. Again, they're several years old at this point. The last I had seen was, I think at one of their meetings or upcoming meetings, they're going to start talking about whether to re-engage that effort, I think. But yeah, MAP says any day now. So hopefully soon. Like I said, there are the proposed changes up there, which sometimes are helpful to illustrate the intent of where they're going with the code. But as of right now, no updated.
Mariah, can I add to that?
Mhm.
Tomorrow afternoon, there'll be a meeting of the BSA Codes Committee, of which I'm the chairman, and also the Access Committee. And we're going to be discussing this very issue. It's in connection with the ANSI requirements, which have been promulgated through ICC. And those whole set of requirements have become increasingly restricted, particularly through the ADA board. So you've seen the new ADA requirements. Those have been incorporated into ANSI. And now there are questions as to, well, what do we do here? Now, the governor has issued an executive order requiring that all agencies in the state related to construction have to adopt a national standard. The Access Board here has declined to do that. So the governor said, well, until you resolve that question of the 30% trigger for when facilities across the state have to comply with the access code in its entirety, you can't have any changes to the 2006 edition. So we're kind of at a standoff because the Access Board doesn't want to address that 30% concern. And the governor doesn't want to let them adopt any new regulations, especially if they are not a national standard. So I think to answer the question, we're not going to see any changes in the AAB requirements for any time that we can see.
Yeah, Carrie made another great point in the chat, and we've done this too, is even though they're only proposed changes because they help show some things that MAP may be accepting of, they are very helpful when going for variances. If there's something that they've changed in the proposed regulations that would affect your project, we've had great success with presenting that to the board and getting that variance.
That's a very good workaround.
Yes.
Craig, I want to ask a follow-up question to that. Is the governor asking that the 30% threshold be stripped from the code altogether?
No. What the governor wants to know is how can we equitably apply the requirements across the state when property values are so extremely variable?
Okay.
Okay, the 30%, if I'm developing or fixing a property in Holyoke, construction costs and real estate values are not in line like they are here, let's say, in Winchester.
Sure.
So if I'm looking to, so let's say I've got $100,000 property, that's a small property here, and it's a huge property in Holyoke. But if I want to repair my building in Holyoke, the construction costs are comparable or fairly comparable to what they are here. So there's a discrepancy that the developers and property owners are complaining about. They feel that they're being unfairly treated by requiring this 30% threshold without any exceptions. Now, in my conversations with the Access Committee, they're kind of adamant that they want to leave it alone, but they don't have a resolution to the problem. And I think in some ways, they don't see a problem at all. I think that the 30% requirement should be there regardless. And part of that, I believe, is motivated by a desire to see everybody comply with the access requirements, regardless of what you're doing. So it's a dilemma that I don't see is going to be resolved unless the governor puts his foot down and says, if you can't resolve it, then take it out. What I have said to the Access Committee is, let's propose, first of all, let's separate the issues. The 30% threshold should be separated out from the other issues so that we can then adopt a national standard. And it turns out, it looks like the ANSI is going to be the way to go. If we can do that, then what the ABA, the Access Board can do is they can attach amendments what effectively would restore the current access regulations. So we would have a national standard with all of the amendments that are currently unique in Massachusetts, except for the 30% rule that I think would resolve all the conflicts that have been argued about for quite a long while.
Has the committee considered the 20% threshold that the ADA has? So it's just 20% of the project cost are put towards accessibility improvements?
I haven't heard anything one way or the other. But you're welcome to join us tomorrow. It's a great conversation.
I plan
It'll
to.
be at noon.
Yep, I plan to.
Thank you for sharing. Philippe, any closing remarks?
I actually have a question, if you could, that we briefly touched upon earlier on, but maybe we can talk about it here as a group, is as we start seeing more senior living going a little bit more vertical, and I looked at the diagram that you had about the podium, where only in that podium assisted living could live, or any other higher level of care higher than residential. Could you, I know we talked about this, but I think this group might be interested to hear, is there any new kind of type of construction that we could hope for are coming, like the mass timber that I know you and Mariah have been researching and helping, at least planning for when these changes in the code come up, help us in maybe a little bit more, go more vertical than 3 stories in a non-combustible for assisted living or memory care. As the buildings kind of start to go a little bit more vertical in senior living in urban environments.
I thought of that as we were going through the presentation and wished we had added that part in because it's a great conversation. So what Philippe is referring to is the 2021 edition of the IBC has expanded on mass timber construction. So there's now 4 different types of mass timber. And they're very significant in height, and it would allow the ability to build beyond what we were showing in the slide deck earlier with the limitations for assisted living and skilled nursing. So we're really eager to bring this to Massachusetts, New England, and beyond. There's been a number of projects completed more on the West Coast with this concept, but now that it's formally written and published in the code, like we've been saying, we oftentimes use future editions of the code, reviewing that with the local jurisdictions to make a case for a proposed design, even though it's not yet adopted in the state that we're building.
Yeah, there's a decent amount of projects, like Caitlin mentioned, out west that are starting to use the mass timber, not just senior living facilities, but really any type of facility. And we could go into a lot more detail, obviously, as a separate effort, but there generally may be some hesitation because it is a combustible material. I mean, it's wood. But Philippe and I were talking earlier, there's a significant amount of scientific research that shows the ability of these large timber members to withstand the effects of fire. So that's why these new code changes have been implemented. And like Caitlin mentioned, a lot of projects, not so many here in New England yet, hopefully soon, are starting to use the 2021 IBC as guidance for these types of projects. So.
We'd be interested in starting a mass timber committee with the BSA if there's enough interest.
I have
Great
another
idea.
question. Do we have another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
We do.
Maybe it's
Yes.
not 5 minutes, but the question is about the concept of grandfathering, which I keep hearing a lot from clients that do stupid things and say, but we're grandfathered, aren't we? And the example that I have in mind right now is an older building from, I think, 50s or 60s that was built originally as non-combustible, non-protected. And at one point in its life, it changed use and it became a skilled nursing facility. And I think whoever was orchestrating the change said, oh, it's masonry and steel, we're good. So nobody made a point of checking that all the steel was not protected. So we're trying to figure out, we're doing a very small project there. We're trying to figure out what are our responsibilities and whether something that was supposed to have happened when the use changed and didn't, are we responsible of now going and wrapping all the columns?
That's a great question. And I love your commentary to begin. And I always say, if I had $1 for every time somebody told me, but I did that, we've done that in the past, when they don't want to hear a code answer. This is interesting. So this would fall under the Mass General Law. And I don't believe, I could be wrong, but there are very few general laws in Massachusetts that are retroactive. So the sprinkler law is one of them. That was revised a few years ago. So I need to dig into the general law to see if it is. It might be a case where, yeah, it's always tough existing non-conforming conditions. If you're not changing the use today and you're not adding on to the building, you really don't often need to look at construction type. But I understand your concern.
They screwed up before. So it's usually
Right.
when you look at MAAB and you say I'm grandfathered, the guys at and girls at MMAB would come back and say, no,
Right.
when it was built or when it was renovated, you should have done it and now you're liable. So that's like the whole, maybe we should have a session on grandfathering. How appropriate for design for aging.
Ruth, would you like me to arrange that at the codes committee?
That would be lovely.
That'll be great.
That would be great.
We can,
And
in
maybe we
fact,
could do a joint meeting.
we can get some of our friends at AKF.
Of course.
We'd be happy to.
I'm still organizing meetings for later this year, so maybe we can do that.
Sure.
It's a very good conversation. It has never been, I've been chairman for 10 years, and it's never been one of our topics. So grandfathering,
Great.
okay.
Yeah.
I do want to make one comment about the, from my perspective, I've run into this before, where a facility was changed in use or whatever, and then later on, a third time, somebody wanted to renovate, and we got the project, and we flagged the fact that there were these non-compliances. And sad to say, in the sense of the cost to the owner, we had to make the adjustments. And one of them was a healthcare facility. It was a compounded problem. It was a one-story healthcare facility. And as you know, in the Commonwealth, it is Mass General Law that all healthcare facilities are, do I hear it? Type 1 construction.
That's right.
So we had a facility and it had bar joists in the ceiling for the roof. And it had spindly little 8-inch or 10-inch square tube columns. Everything had to be fire protected. We got around it at the ceiling by finding a 2-hour lay-in ceiling that met all the ASTM and UL requirements. And by putting that in, and putting hoods and so on over all the ceiling lights and so on, we were able to save the day, because spray fireproofing bar joists, that's one nightmare I didn't want
In a hospital setting at that.
in a hospital setting, exactly. So anyhow, I'll stop at that.
Any last comments? It's 6:44. I want to be mindful of everybody's time.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Caitlin and Mariah, thank you very much for spending this hour and a half with us and giving us a lot of knowledge and a good session for us to learn and continue doing what we do in a creative way, because I know that our creativity sometimes feels like we are hitting sometimes a wall, which is the code, but your help in a lot of the projects that I've been working on, your creativity around interpretations of codes, still giving us safe buildings that are code compliant, was a great help for us and for a lot of us architects here around the room. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You're welcome. So just a note, we meet every 2 months. So our next meeting will be the 3rd Tuesday of May. Hopefully we'll have a nice weather, better than today. And we're starting happy spring, everybody. And thank you for joining us.
Great.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.